Thank you, everybody, for coming to the session this afternoon. So I'm just going to dive right in here. So this is my main question. Is it possible to identify intersecting power relations through the spatial analysis of a dynamic archaeological landscape? So that question probably requires a little breaking down. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what do I mean by intersecting power relations and a dynamic archaeological landscape, and also what modeling tools, what spatial analysis am I going to be doing? So when I refer to intersecting power relations, I'm really drawing from intersectional theory, intersectionality, which emerged from Black feminist thinkers in the 19th and 20th century. The term wasn't coined until the 1990s, but it's a way of thinking about society that has its roots at least in the 19th, if not the 18th century. It's considered a traveling theory because it's been taken and applied to a lot of different disciplines in a lot of different contexts. And some people refer to it as kind of a meta theory where a lot of other theories get used within a framework, or what Patricia Hill Collins calls a knowledge project, to kind of tease apart some of these social relations. So Dr. Collins lays out 6 guiding principles of what she calls intersectional knowledge projects. And I kind of underscored some of the key words, but in bold are some things that I think are particularly interesting for archaeologists. So we're going to start here with social classes or categories are best understood in relational terms rather than in isolation from one another. So these categories, which in the US are usually race, class, gender, age, religion, but in different times and places, maybe different social categories, they're all related to one another. Also, the second one, they're mutually constructing. So not only are they related to one another, but as they develop over time, they're influencing one another and the shape in which these power relations are formed. Third, intersecting systems of power manifest formations of complex social inequalities that are organized via unequal material realities and distinctive social experiences. Well, here we're talking about material realities. That's what we look at as archaeologists. So this means that we probably have a role in understanding intersectional power relations in the past. Social formations of complex social inequalities are historically contingent and cross-culturally specific. Unequal material realities and social experiences vary across time and space. So this is a big one for us. Historically contingent is pretty obvious. Cross-culturally specific. I'm an American archaeologist, so I got to throw culture in there. And vary across time and space. Well, that's really what we look at, and that's where some of the most interesting conclusions from archaeology has come from, is that sort of analysis. Also, groups differentially placed within these intersecting power relations have different points of view, and from their points of view, they are engaging in different projects to advance people in their own and similar positions. And lastly, because of that, you have people in power who are most able to kind of maintain their position of power over time or uphold the status quo. For dynamic archaeological landscapes, I'm talking about a synthesis of human and environmental components in a landscape that are changing through time, whether it's environmental changes, social and human changes, or a combination of the two. And so these provide an opportunity to look at shifting relations and power relations over time as well. For my spatial analysis here, the 2 models I'm using are a proximity analysis using a travel time cost service model that was developed by some people in the National Park Service in the US, and also the total viewshed analysis tool from QGIS. And the third one I'm working on now but didn't quite get together in time for the conference is looking at agriculture potential model and that relation to different settlement patterns over time. So my work is at Montpelier, which is a plantation in the Mid-Atlantic region in central Virginia, and what's called the Piedmont region. So it's kind of this hilly section between the flat tidewater and floodplains, and then the Blue Ridge Mountains to the west. And so this photo shows the main house of the Montpelier property on the right-hand side, facing east, and so you get an idea of kind of the terrain we're talking about. Here's an aerial image. So, of course, the woodlots and fields are different. They've changed over time. but it gives you an idea of kind of the environment that we're talking about. Here is a digital elevation model with a hillshade from LiDAR survey we were able to do last year with a drone, so low-flying, high-resolution LiDAR, where our grid cells are about 2 to 3 centimeters. But for the analysis, I'm usually running at a much larger cell size. So some quick background information, the occupational history of this property, Montpelier. It was initially occupied by Native Americans, of course. Up until the 18th century, the Monacan people occupied the land. Initially, the first people other than Monacans to come there were enslaved Africans who were sent there by the property owners to prepare the land, build the houses, build the roads, so everything was nice and ready for them when they moved there, generally a decade or two later. And that's when the Madison family first moved there. So these are the grandparents of President Madison. So Ambrose and Francis Madison. Ambrose died like right after he got there. 3 enslaved people were convicted of poisoning him. So don't know if that actually happened or not. 1 was put to death, but the other 2 were returned to the care of Frances Madison. So maybe she had something to do with it. Frances Madison continued to control the property and run the plantation for the rest of her life, which is very unusual for this time because typically she would have been required legally to hand the property over to her eldest son when he came of age. But she had a high-powered father, and she could basically do what she wanted, and so she ran the plantation the way she wanted to. Colonel Madison, or James Madison Sr., didn't take over the property until the 1760s, which is when he built the house that you just saw in the picture a couple minutes ago. And when he passed away in 1801, President James Madison took over control of the property till his death when his wife took over. And because of the debt that was accrued under President Madison's control, she had to start subdividing and selling the property and eventually sold the last of it off in the 1840s. At this time, the property continued to get subdivided up until the Civil War. And of course, that was a big moment in American history and also in the settlement patterns, as we're going to see in a minute, when the enslaved African Americans in the area were set free. After that, the land continued to be controlled by a combination of the wealthy planter class, as well as a lot of free African Americans who owned small farms or rented tenant farms from these wealthy planters. And in 1900 and 1901, William DuPont purchased Montpelier and then started to buy up all the land surrounding the current property or the property at that time. And so he was able to grow it to about 2,700 acre property, which is what is today owned by the National Trust for Historic Places and managed by the Montpelier Foundation. So during this time, there were a number of technological changes as well as social changes. Initially, it was hoe agriculture because as the trees were being felled, you couldn't run a plow with all the root systems. Eventually, they could start plowing. And with the plow agriculture, you have the introduction of grain because the tobacco markets were all over the place. You start to see a lot of gristmill infrastructure on the landscapes, modification of plows to increase productivity, introduction of threshing machines, and probably the biggest change was the end of slavery, which I mentioned. Then in the late 19th century, you start to get the introduction of chemical fertilizers and additional mechanization of agriculture, which meant you needed less people, but you could produce more food, assuming you could afford the investment in those 2 things. The data I'm using for my analysis comes from a combination of metal detector survey of the property, historic maps, aerial imagery, and the LiDAR survey I mentioned earlier. The metal detector surveying has gone on there for almost 2 decades at this point. It's changed methodologies a few times because they were having a hard time identifying the 18th century sites, but the 19th century sites were pretty good coverage, and that's what I'm going to focus on, the period from 1808 to 1908. So I divided up the sites into different time periods based on when we had the best information, as well as when we were seeing major changes in the social or agricultural organization. So we have 3 for President Madison, 1808, 1816, 1838. We have the late antebellum, right before the end of slavery. Then we have the 1890 period, which you can kind of think of as the freedmen period or the free African American period. And then 1908, which is after DuPont had started consolidating the land. So, two analyses. Proximity analysis is what I'm going to start with. And for today, I'm going to be talking about the relationship between workers and work buildings, essentially. So, we're going to see a few things as we go through these time slices. You're going to see an increase in the number of slave quarters, with 1838 kind of being the peak. That's right when after Madison passed away. Then you start to see a shift of slave quarters away from the main house, which is the orange dot in the center here. And then after the Civil War, you still have a few African American sites on the property, but the vast majority left for what might seem to be obvious reasons, not wanting to stick around where they had been enslaved. Makes sense. And then we have DuPonts. So you have a lot more laborer houses, but you have a mix of white and black workers at that time. So what are some of the things we see here? Just to back up, we see a pretty close proximity between slave quarters and agricultural sites, agricultural buildings, barns, things like that. And even as they spread throughout the landscape, you have new barns popping up. So you have this close relationship between residences, domestic sites, and labor sites. You get a big change after the end of slavery, where the free black residents are living the furthest they have in many generations from sites associated with labor. After DuPont starts to consolidate that, you have an interesting shift where the spatial proximity of laborers' houses to work buildings actually returns to a pattern that you see during the time of slavery. But what's really unique is, if you look here, the African American laborers' sites still maintain their separation. It's really the white laborers that are maintaining this close proximity to work buildings at this time. So we're able to see here some variation between races and class using this proximity analysis. In the viewshed analysis, what's the relationship between visibility at different scales of people with different races and economic statuses? And was visibility used as a tool of control for agricultural laborers? So here I'm showing two total view sheds. One was calculated using a 150 meter radius and the other a 5,000 meter radius. So the 150 meter radius is to represent kind of the distance that you can really actively surveil people working around you, see what they're actually doing, make out who they are. And so with these, we find that African American sites are in high visibility areas for the 150 meter radius. And that is maintained all the way up until after the Civil War, when you start to have African Americans being located in some of the lower visibility areas. So that means that, of course, they're able to be surveilled by people who are watching over them in the fields during the time of slavery, but they're able to kind of isolate themselves visually from surveillance after the end of slavery. One of the things that kind of surprised me was, if you look at the elite residences, there's not many of them, these orange dots, they are in the 150 meter radius, always in very low visibility areas. I expected to see them in high visibility areas, and this suggests that they're not being placed in an area where they're necessarily able to watch people around them or be watched. They're not placing their homes in places for anybody on the plantation. When you look at the 5,000 meter radius here, you see that they're in very high visibility places. So these houses are being placed in areas where they have fantastic views of the mountains off in the distance, and where people off in the distance can see these huge houses and sort of represent their status, essentially, on the landscape. After the Civil War, you do start to see African American homes moving into more visually prominent locations, but they never quite reach the same level of visual prominence as you get with the big white-owned property owners. So a couple of tables here to kind of highlight this. This is the 1808 table showing the elite residence with the lowest visibility at 150 meter radius and the highest visibility at 5,000 meter radius. And when you look 100 years later in 1908, you maintain pretty much that relationship. So they have the lowest visibility at the 150 meter radius. There's a few more houses as the property got divided up. And except for a couple exceptions, they have the highest visibility at the 5,000 meter range. But if you look further down between white and African American workers, there's less of a distinction there. So you can see kind of economic class in this visual analysis, but you can't necessarily pull out race from it. So in conclusions, is it possible using multiple models to start to tease out some of these intersecting power relationships? And right now, kind of. I'm hoping as I add a couple more models that we'll be able to tease more of that out. But I do encourage other people to look at intersectional theory and think about how that might apply to interpreting the landscapes that they're working with. Thank you.